All right. Thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I guess it is now in the East Coast. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included more than $64 billion for broadband, divided into many areas. I'm going to share my screen with you just for a moment to show how it's all divided up and what we're talking about. So there are lots of different components. Some of it being administered by the FCC, some by USDA, but the bulk of it is through NTIA. And within the pot that's going to NTIA, that is also divided into different sections. This is by the law, not the NOFO. And we're going to be talking about the BEAD program, which is $42.45 billion. In this chart, this is the things in the orange tones. I apologize that the colors don't go together very well. That's not my strong suit. And then in addition to that, NTIA also oversees the Digital Inclusion and Equity Program, the Tribal Program, and the Middle Mile Program. And I believe there are NOFOs on those too, but those not what we're discussing today. Okay. So NTIA recently released its Notice of Funding Opportunities, or NOFO, for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, BEAD. The law also divides BEAD into various components, as we saw. And it's the BEAD NOFO that we're talking about today. We have a very distinguished group of experts here to discuss this. Let me introduce each of them just briefly by name and affiliation, because we don't have a lot of time. And we'll just go alphabetically. We have Michelle Connolly, who is professor of practice at the economics department at Duke University. Evan Feinman, who is the director of the BEAD program at NTIA. Evelyn Ramali, who is a partner at Wilkinson Barker Nauer. Paroma Sanyal, who is a senior consultant at the Brattle Group. And Nicole Turner-Lee, who is a senior fellow at Governance Studies and director of the Center for Technology Innovation, Brookings Institution. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we have Sarah O. Lamb, who's a senior fellow at Technology Policy Institute, who will be co-moderating with me. And I'm Scott Walston, who's president and senior fellow at TPI. Now, to the audience, I encourage you to ask questions whenever you have them, and in the Q&A box, I guess, and we will work them, try to work them organically into the conversation. So let us start with I guess we'll start with the order that I sent some questions to, with the Buy America component. So the NOFO requires, and the law requires, the grant recipient, or sorry, the entities who are making the grants to follow the Buy America program, requiring American-made equipment and so on. And then the NOFO says, unless it increases the cost by about 25%. So, right now we know that it's difficult to find labor. There are supply chain issues. I guess the first question is, do we think that Buy America is a binding constraint? Will it increase, likely to increase prices? And where will the resources come from? Who would like to kick that off?
Well, I can start. I mean, definitely it will increase. I mean, given that we have the supply chain shortages, and there's so many, I mean, not only BEAD, but we also have the ARPA funds going out. We have so much construction going on that there's going to be real scarcity of resources in terms of the physical equipment, the fiber, all those things. So anything that puts a constraint on how you can buy it and where you can buy it is going to be an issue. And especially because like ARPA is not tied to the maps, the FCC maps, in the same way that the BEAD money is. So that's likely to start construction projects sooner. And it could easily create even more of a supply chain issue. So I think any of the things related to that, as well as with labor hiring and labor conditions that are kind of tied there, are going to be limitations. They're inherently restrictions on what can be done, and therefore make it more difficult, more costly, and slower.
Oh, sorry, Evan, you were about to say something, or are you just breathing?
Yeah, breathing. I mean, the thing I will say is that as an economic, as an axiomatic economic principle, right? If you reduce supply of something, costs go up. The considerations that went into both the inclusion of the Buy America provisions in the law, as well as the opportunities for and directive that we minimize the use of waivers, are intended to take into account a holistic look at the American economy and those virtuous feedback loops that can exist. And so, I think within the four corners of an individual project, you may see some cost escalation, but across the totality of engagement with the economy, there's an opportunity for there to be benefits, significant benefits from the Buy American provisions.
Can I jump in, Scott? This is Nicole. So I think, to your question, we obviously know where this ideologically is coming from, right? Because we've had a long ongoing conversation around, security concerns when it also comes to telecom equipment. It is not based in the United States. But I would suggest that we have to also think about, the larger provision. I'll sort of tag on what Evan and Michelle have said, which is what is the ultimate purpose of having that as a major provision driving the funding? Because if that is going to be a barrier to build out and closing the digital divide, we have to think cautiously about that. I would also say the second thing is one of the areas that I know I'm working on and we're trying to figure out is it's not just about Buy America, but it's also about employ Americans. And we have a whole lot of underrepresented, dislocated workers, particularly those from diverse populations, that may not benefit from the 160,000, 200,000 plus jobs that are going to come out of the infrastructure bill. And so I would love to have, more conversation here or offline on how are we bringing these things together so that we're also incentivizing American companies to hire producers and people who can actually work in the production capacity of this new infrastructure money. Because without that, I think we're going to see a lot of what we've seen in the last few years, particularly when we're dealing with mobile networks. We're going to see this diversion away from non-American goods, but we're not going to see that actually increase the type of labor force capacity that I think we still need in this country when it comes to telecom infrastructure.
So Scott, I just wanted to touch on something that Nicole said. I think it's appropriate to recognize that this is a mix of policy objectives and not just a pure sort of broadband deployment policy. And I think once we recognize that, it becomes easier to understand that, yes, there might be certain trade-offs in higher costs, maybe slightly lower deployment, but there are other objectives that this plan is getting towards. And I think having a conversation there and making all the constituents comfortable with this sort of multiple policy objective is, I think, something that's going to make this much more successful and palatable, and not just have this one single focus of, yes, it's just deployment and nothing else.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. I think that was very well stated. You could certainly charge forward with projects and say, and we're going to eliminate environmental review, and we're going to eliminate climate resiliency, and we're going to eliminate fair labor standards. And each of those could reduce costs if you were only looking at that one column. But long term, that's not the kind of wise investment that we want to make programmatically. And you can recharacterize the Buy American and the workforce provisions and labor provisions as their own sorts of resiliency and provisions and opportunities for states to deepen their own workforce, to deepen their own domestic supply chains and provide resiliency against future supply chain shocks, as well as whatever the next black swan is going to be, right? Nobody in 2019 was thinking about a global pandemic. We don't know what the next thing's going to be. There are opportunities as well as expenses presented in each of these additional requirements.
So I see this also though as, Parney, we have various objectives, but that's also a problem because if you have multiple objectives, you can't maximize any one of them. And it does seem like though the NOFO has made an explicit determination that it's worth spending 25% more in order to follow these other objectives, to try to meet these other objectives. So so that's about, we're willing to spend about $10 billion on other things, higher wages and more expensive materials, instead of broadband to meet those objectives. Not saying that it will be 25%, but that's the maximum. Do we think that's kind of the right number, recognizing that we have all these different objectives?
Well, so I think first things first, each state and territory has to really be thinking through in its planning how it is going to reach 100% of unserved and underserved in those communities. So, that's going to weigh in terms of whether waivers are needed in this process. From a very practical standpoint, with the goal being to reach as many Americans as possible, I think the administration, even though it is taking this holistic view and has multiple national security, economic security goals that it's trying to reach, recognizes that in some instances, waivers will likely be necessary. However, would like to see those waivers be very targeted in terms of project specific, product specific, time limited. It's not going to be the same situation that we saw in BTOP where there were blanket waivers, but certainly to make sure that we can have small and mediums compete, having access to waivers is likely important. The Department of Commerce itself published a report earlier this year in February, talking about how difficult the ICTS supply chain environment is. So it's a real challenge. And so they have said that they will look at these closely. And so there is some question about whether a state needs to go directly for the waivers or whether the private sector has an opportunity to weigh in for waivers as well. I think some of that, hopefully, guidance is still coming from the department. But again, limited, but we know that for things like electronics in these networks, we're likely going to have some waivers taking place. So hopefully we'll see that action beginning to occur so that we can get a jump on it. Obviously, we just have 4 years to implement these and we're trying to reach everyone. So this does need to be part of the picture.
To expand on the multiple objectives issue a little bit, this is a complicated one. The digital equity component of BEAD, because equity is it's included in its name, but the digital inclusion and equity component of the law is not part of BEAD. So somehow, BEAD should complement that, right? I mean, they have to incorporate it somehow. And it seems that the way that the NOFO does that is by requiring low-cost plans. So I guess the first question is, is this the best way to be to have that complementary role, and what are the likely implications of it?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, listen, I think that to your point, Scott, and those folks who have heard me speak about this, I think that we sort of got this a little bit wrong with regards to NOFO, and I'll be public about it. We talk about equity in the digital ecosystem. We should be talking about equity from both the production of networks to the adoption of networks. And for some reason, we still sort of place equity on the consumptive side of this. And I think that's going to sort of interfere with some of these goals that we're talking about previously as to whether or not we're going to build the capacity in America for everybody to participate, not use, participate in this new productive economy. So I'm worried that we're not requiring states to really tell us more so, and I know it's got to be approved and submitted, but to tell us how they're integrating equity into the design and build of these networks, in addition to the adoption and the literacy and use of these networks. We have come to a stage that being online, as we saw in the pandemic, is a matter of not just whether or not you can go to school, but it's also a matter of whether or not we're going to have culturally sensitive and diverse applications that are offered to populations. And so if we don't really think about equity in terms of the type of diversity that states are deploying when it comes to who's building networks, what types of firms are supplying products and services, who's helping with some of the evaluation and training, I think we're going to find ourselves not increasing, I like the way Evan said it, getting the full gamut of the type of outputs that we want to see in this type of legislation. Having been a person that actually sat through 2 BTOPs, one as a recipient the first time and the second one as a recipient until I went into the think tank world, I already know. I've been there, done that. I think it's just really important that the president has stressed that he wants 100% adoption, particularly among the underserved and the unserved. We just don't want to make sure that they have the shiny object in their hand. We want to solve issues of poverty, social isolation, economic development. And so I think it's really important for us to really re-envision what you said, that equity is not just about a low-cost program, it's actually about building an ecosystem of participation.
So can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, not to write a your own NOFO right here.
It hasn't come out yet. I'm trying to get it out, but I keep getting on panels.
So like, what does equity mean on the availability side specifically?
Well, I think it means, for example, that we think carefully about how are we going to get broadband to areas in rural communities that may have more cows than people, where it may not be fiscally sound to actually bring in fiber, where we may have to do hybrid models. How does it look to ensure that educators are not sitting here scratching their head right now as the COVID numbers rise, trying to figure out how to get money to support a hotspot or to get laptops into the classroom? I think equity for us has been resigned to get people online in this very binary perspective, and they'll go out there and explore the world. But what we're finding is that it's actually a determinant of your livelihood. Just like we say that health is a social determinant, I think not having technology access is the same. And so I think as we move forward, we want this program to look at equity more broadly and not necessarily splice it out just for the adoption. I have been actively saying that I think when states submit their plans, they need to be suggesting not just how they're going to get people served through low-cost programs or open Wi-Fi architecture or partnerships with community organizations, but they're going to bring in diverse suppliers to help build those networks, people who look like the communities that they're serving as well.
Yeah, I mean, the things a couple of things, and I think everything we just heard was spot on in terms of what a high quality plan would look like and what we want to see states put together. First, I'll make the caveat, and and I understand that there's TPI does a lot of really strong analysis, and there are smart people here who can comment. My view, given who I am and what I'm doing right now, needs to be that the Congress has made no mistakes in the past or in the present, right? And so when it's like, whoa, should this have been this way, I'm going to always have to say yes or demur that. But what I will say is that this is a sea change in the way the federal government is approaching the concept of digital equity. It is similarly a sea change in the way the federal government is approaching its infrastructure mission. At the conclusion of the BEAD program, two things will certainly have happened. One, every single American home and business is going to have an option for available high-speed broadband internet connectivity. That is not the case today, and it will be the case at the conclusion of this program. The second is an amount of resources directed through carefully reviewed and analyzed state plans will flow to efforts designed to promote digital equity and inclusion that are multiple orders of magnitude more than the entire lifetime amount of resources that have ever gone into that sector. So there's no way around the fact that this is going to be an incredible turning point in both the digital equity and the infrastructure deployment spaces. The question is just how good a job are we going to be able to do between now and the conclusion of the program? I have high hopes. It's early days yet. We need a bunch of people to put their shoulders to the wheel. There's no way we can do a great job without a whole of community and whole of society approach.
So, I mean, obviously there are lots of constraints, different groups, and you've got the law pushing one way and other ideas you have. But it seems to me that we're talking about benefits. Like, everything here would be a benefit. This would be a benefit, and that would be a benefit. But everything has a cost, right? And so, how much more should we spend on deployment, say, to make sure that that the companies look like America? And I mean, I don't know how we do that calculation. That's a judgment. That's a value judgment. But how do we think about it? Because we can't just say, oh, we need to have this benefit and we need to have that benefit. We need to know how much we're willing to pay for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can step in, one of the issues. I mean, sorry, am I muted? No.
No, you're good.
Okay. One of the issues is like all of these things seem distractions to the main point, which is reaching unserved areas, right? And servicing them in a way that, as Nicole is talking about. And my fear is that with all these other policy concerns we're interested in, and the fact that they're going to disperse 25% of the funding after the initial proposal is approved. And there's no requirement that unserved gets taken care of first, right? So they say, as long as there's a plan to serve unserved, then we can start serving underserved. And if there's a plan that shows that, that claims we're going to hit 100% of unserved, then we can start also working on underserved. And if there's a plan to hit 100% of underserved, then we can start planning on working on these community anchor institutions. Okay, so all of this is going, all this money is being dispersed at the same time. There's nothing sequential, right? And I'm not saying that it's bad for it to not be sequential, but you add that, and then you add all these constraints, and then what is the risk? Like if the project bidder who's winning on the unserved areas goes belly up, then all the money has been spent and we still end up with the unserved not being served. I kind of feel like there is so much money here. It would be impressive if we still managed to have unserved areas, okay? But I also see that there are enough waivers and exceptions and constraints and other policy goals in here that could actually happen. I don't trust right now the way this is set up that we can guarantee what I think is the laudable goal of reaching and properly serving the unserved. Right now, I see a lot of money for overbuild, and I see a lot of money, there for the community anchor institutions. They're saying, once we have a plan to hit unserved and underserved, then you can justify a project for community anchor if it doesn't have 1 gigabytes up and down, or down and up, I should say. There is a lot of wiggle room in here, and I am just worried that the eye is not being kept on the prize. Because if we look, there's a ton of money. I agree that this is achievable, but not if it's being diverted to everything else.
Can I jump in on what Michelle's saying? And I think that Michelle has said it just very eloquently, right? This is not about, so Evan, we're not being Debbie Downers on the program. We're excited. I mean, this is more money, like you said, that is unimaginable. The question is, are we approaching it as we go through the funding cycle, the bureaucracy of government, in a holistic manner? Communities are made of anchor institutions. That's what held us together during the pandemic. Churches and local businesses that allowed their stoops for kids to finish their homework. Part of what I kind of watch on the sidelines is the extent to which we're actually developing and putting in plans to create a new ecosystem. I'm the vice chair of the FCC's Communications, Equity, and Diversity Council. And we think about these questions. Are we going to actually impact systemic change by this money? And are we going to, yes, get everybody connected, but get everybody connected so that they have it, and I like the way Scott put it, an achievable end, not a benefit, but an end. They can actually participate in this new emerging economy that we have. So I think Michelle hits it. It's sort of the way it's divided. There might be, not saying it's going to happen, but there might be a tendency to fall away from the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve, which then puts us back to sort of relitigating how much impact we've actually made.
Yeah, and if I could respond to that briefly, I mean, the thing that I would say is I understand certainly I understand the concern. It's something that we've identified and that we think about. But the second thing is the model that this program contemplates is significantly different from prior federal efforts. And as somebody who was a state level practitioner, I'm very heartened by that. It's part of what attracted me to this role. And there is going to be, the NOFO is not, as it so often was with prior programs, the NOFO is not the last word. Rather, a ton of the program design, implementation of safeguards, budgetary caution, right? Are we segregating enough additional spend beyond what we think the right on the nose dollar amount to get every unserved person connected? Those decisions get pushed to the state plan development so that each state will have the opportunity to develop a plan that works for it. People have correctly identified that a program that has guardrails wide enough for there to be a compliant Alaska plan and a compliant Arizona plan means that there's also room between those guardrails for states to make unwise choices. And so the reason that we are pursuing a staffing model that we haven't talked about here, but that I'll share briefly, which is that placing high level senior expert staff in each state and territory to assist in the development and guidance of those plans, stakeholder outreach, coalition development, and office capacity management for each state and territory is because so much critical work will happen post NOFO during the implementation within each state as a subgrantee.
Evan, I think that was that was really heartening, because one of the things that Michelle said really struck a chord. The levels of the plans submitted and the level of bureaucracy, all that when you put it together, it's almost like you're giving them 4 years. When does it really happen when they have to fulfill so many things? And as we've seen, even in very simple RDOF process, when you go through it and the challenges, and it's just a really time-consuming process that all of these operators are used to. The smaller ones might not, especially these sub-grantees. And that, I think I really echo Michelle's worry there as to, seems like a great program, but implementation-wise, how will we achieve that 100% deployment?
Well, so, there's a couple of different ways, and we can't get it. It's going to look different in Alaska than it will in Arizona, which will look different than in Delaware. And that'll look different than Puerto Rico, right? But and that's part of the strength of the plan. The other thing that I'd point people back to, and this is, a cliche, but there's a foundational truth. You can do something wisely, you can do it quickly, or you can do it inexpensively, and you get to pick two of those three, right? Or you get to be somewhere within that kind of triangle. Recognizing that this is a generational opportunity to accomplish these goals, it's not about pushing funds out into projects as swiftly as absolutely possible. That's true, right? But that's because there isn't likely to be another opportunity to come back and clean up this mess to the tune of billions of dollars if we create a mess. So what it's incumbent upon us to do is ensure that each state plan meets the program's goals and the public's goals. And so that's why it's not the speediest program in the world, and we're the first to acknowledge that. We're going to go as quickly as we can while having certainty that these are going to be wise investments.
I'm sorry, one last thing, and I know, Sarah, you want to jump in because I don't know where Scott went. But listen, the other thing I would just say, kind of going back to the digital equity question then, I think for all of us on this call, I think there's going to be some significant components that we do have to make sure we're narrowly focused on. One is this participatory framework that states must engage in if they're actually going to receive these funds. What are the public meetings that are going to happen? Are states going to require to share who they share their plans with? What type of feedback loops and input stations will be in place before these plans actually get the 25%, or if they get the 25%, before they get the rest of the money? I think that's really important. That happened in the first iteration of the TOP grant. Like I said, I'm aging myself. I was the top participant and a BTOP participant. But I think the nature of those grants were a little different because they were experiential in many respects, and they were programmatic. And in some cases, they were short term. In some cases, they were longer term. I think the second thing that is important too, not only should we have a participatory framework, but I think, we have to be bold enough for the people who are on the side of the unserved or underserved to let their states know that it's not working for them. And so where does that feedback loop come in so that we can have some portion of the time or some portion of the money really evaluate the scope and the breadth of those grants? I'm putting it out there because I think, like you said, there's no silver bullet for this, but if we want this to be different, I think we have to engage stakeholders. I talked to community health clinics, local educational institutions that have not been called by their states to even give input on those plans. And so making sure that we have this feedback loop, I think may break, Evan, what you're talking about, what others are talking about, some of the cycle of duplicity that we've had every time we get bulks of money to try to solve the digital divide problem.
This brings us to our next section about evaluation. And so the NOFO has transparency requirements for recipients, and it requires states to make proposals public. But like some people here have said, it's a pretty vague or general requirement. What really is needed to do effective program evaluation? How can we measure that BEAD is successful? And that's something that concerns me as well. There's a lot of work up front to get the proposals out and reviewed and the money out, but time and time again, the evaluation part is just left over for someone else to do. And then outcomes don't turn out the way that proposals have promised. And so that just seems to be the game plan. Make a really strong proposal and don't worry about outcomes. They'll happen later. And then, money's wasted. But is there a way for this round of stimulus to be different from BTOP, to be different from TOP, to be different from RUS, where even the RUS program, it's a mystery what happens to the money. can we really measure where it's going?
Well, but while you're answering that, I just want to point at a little interesting anecdote from when I dropped out. I live in broadband nirvana. In Tacoma Park, Maryland, we have Comcast, RCN, Fios, T-Mobile 5G hotspot, and Verizon 5G hotspot, and maybe even some WISPs. I don't know. I right now have two for the T-Mobile's 5G and RCN. And I thought our RCN service wasn't working so well, so I tried to switch to the T-Mobile's 5G. And it turns out it's my Wi-Fi network. And I thought I had a good one, a mesh network. But each one works perfectly when I'm just using it, as soon as I connect it to my Wi-Fi. Anyway, just a point, it's hard for people to know what exactly the problems are. So let's go back to things that aren't about me. And it's Aaron's question of evaluation.
I just wanted to weigh in a bit on this. I think for economists, the moment we hear program evaluation, a pre-post scenario comes to mind. And one of the things while at the FCC, we always struggled with was both the pre and the post, and how to actually collect good data so that we would actually be able to evaluate what happens once the funds are spent. Because yes, you would have the operators submitting maps and submitting what they've done, but there was no independent way really for somebody to go in and do some random testing of the networks and provide that data. I think building in that kind of a third-party mechanism where somebody from outside, either an expert panel or sort of an expert, somebody who can go in and measure these things, not just pure crowdsourced data, but actual sort of, the root metrics kind of type of measurement of networks, and then do a pre-post. Also sort of data on what's available currently, who's providing it, both in particular like census blocks and also surrounding areas, and then seeing after the money is spent, both sort of maybe in 2 years and then sort of at the end, is something that would be wonderful to see, because without that, I think it's very hard to get a handle on what is really happening and what the funds are being spent on. You're unmuted.
What you just said is, I think, beautiful. And I would actually take it a step further, that it would, I think it would behoove the NOFO to kind of encourage maybe some independent analysis as we go. So the NOFO does say we'd like 6 reports every 6 months, both from the entities and the subgrantees. But people can report what is in a report can be very vague. So I think having maybe an independent source really quantify and check what's going on as you're going, again, because of this issue that we want to make sure that the really needy areas do get taken care of, that all the money isn't being just spent in the easy areas or easier areas. To have that and have that be in a quantified fashion. I mean, Georgia has a very interesting map that they have funded themselves, where they actually look at locations within an area. And I've used that data myself because I did find it more informative than the FCC data. Also because we had issues in the past where like municipal broadband service providers aren't reporting to the FCC and things of that nature. So I think you're exactly right that someone who would be on the ground and actually checking these things would be far more effective. And if that were made publicly available, then we could immediately see if deployment is not occurring in the way it's supposed to be occurring, so that there's a chance, if things are going off the rails in one particular area, to observe it and perhaps rectify it before everything is spent and down the drain.
I would recommend that I guess this is not a moderator role, that NTIA fund lots of evaluations. I mean, in the law, it seems to allocate either 5 or 7% of BEAD to administrative.
He's stuck again. So
I think he's frozen. Yeah. So yeah, we were talking about this earlier, but there is some $2 billion allocated for admin and overhead. And I don't know if I read it correctly, but for NTIA in particular, even 2%. Is that correct? Oh, I think Evelyn, you're on mute.
They have about $1 billion for it's around 875 million for admin. Yeah. That has to fund you know, this program over what's likely probably a decade of activity. But certainly evaluation is something that NTIA is thinking very critically about. It's a focus of the administration across the infrastructure programs, wanting to be able to tell that story. One of the reasons why the local engagement and really having states show how they plan to do that in the plan is because of evaluation too. So having both NTIA working with the states on evaluation. Some have the sense that, you know, those 20% and 80% awards are just handed over. No, actually, there's quite a bit of engagement with NTIA along the way where milestones are met and things are approved. So they do have the opportunity to make adjustments while the implementation is happening. So you have that control. And again, you have the control from the local communities as well, because this is such a long program. Actually, being able to do the build out, having that local accountability to keep the project accountable and the states and territories accountable to their plan is going to be critical. So states need to show that to NTIA as well, how there's going to be meaningful engagement to say, yes, we have gotten the connectivity that was promised, it's on track, here's what we still need, that needs to be built in. And in addition, NTIA has been looking, you know, under the Broadband Data Act, there's new data that they actually have to collect by law during this build out across all of the agencies who are doing broadband funding at this time. And they are also looking at a common platform that can give states and territories additional criteria and a common way to track engagement for this program. So I think there'll be more to come from them, and Evan can probably talk to that as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Will it be public? Will the data be public for everyone else to review as well, or?
Most things are going to be public. I mean, there'll be instances in which some proprietary information engages into stuff that will need to stay proprietary, but the vast majority of the information, and in fact the program, is going to operate very much transparently. And you know, and I want to be clear about that. You know, Evelyn was talking about something that's really important, which is this program contemplates not just a kind of a notice and comment where there's an inbox that local governments get to engage with, but rather an ongoing robust level of collaboration between the state office and local and tribal governments, as well as representatives of other core stakeholder groups. And all of this is going to happen way out in the open. So, you know, it is not going to be, everyone will have the opportunity to see every state and territory plan for a period of time that is significant enough for them to engage with them before they even hit send and submit it to NTIA. Our staff will have been working with them side by side, developing that plan throughout the entire process. And our staff, independent of the state broadband office, will also be engaged in direct stakeholder outreach. So if a stakeholder community is not pleased with the level of engagement that they're getting from their state office, they'll be able to report that directly to the NTIA staff in the state or territory. And then we'll get to the bottom of that. That's not to say that we're automatically going to agree with a given stakeholder group or local government, but it certainly is another avenue by which there's kind of a safety mechanism for stakeholders to engage and ensure that these plans meet their needs. And one thing that I will say is, if a community at the prior to plan submission says, this plan that X state or territory is about to submit to NTIA does not accomplish the program goals, either it leaves residents of our community without access to the internet, or it misuses funds or fails to accomplish a stated goal of the program, we're going to get to the bottom of that before we approve that plan. I mean, we're not going to move forward until we have certainty that that's the case.
Can I jump into, I think on the evaluation side, and it hasn't been said yet too, Sarah, and I think it's what you're getting at. I do think that when we talk about evaluation, we do need a third-party evaluation of the program itself. But I think it would be a worthwhile exercise to actually have an evaluation of what Sarah's talking about, to the outcomes. Some of these outcomes are going to be longitudinal, that it is going to take longer to measure the extent to which there was community access, you know, in a computer lab and housing development, that it allowed for people to, you know, have an economic trajectory that was much more positive. it is very difficult to capture that data if you don't actually capture it at the onset. And we know from the research from Pew that, oftentimes it's not cost that is actually the relevant factor. It's whether or not people see the usefulness of the technology. And we still have to see if there are folks who believe that post-pandemic or during pandemic, that being connected really mattered to their life. So I would put it out there too. But I think the onus also rests upon, and I know the Assistant Secretary has spoken about this, the interagency support. How is there some type of evaluation trigger that is bringing the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services together to come up with broad-reaching plans and strategies for how they're impacting change? Without that, I think what I've been seeing, and Evan, of course, you can correct me or anybody, there have been these ancillary conversations from these different agencies on how they're looking at broadband infrastructure. But the extent, to Sarah's point, they're going to actually think about, have we improved upon the condition of K through 12 students who have better access to technology? Have we actually thought about telehealth in a different way because we actually have the critical infrastructure to move that along? It's still not clear who's responsible for that. Is it NTIA? Is it the FCC? Is it the White House? Is it going to be the National Economic Council? I think it's really important for Congress to allocate funds to actually do the due diligence, much like what we're trying to see now with supply chain. Where do we go wrong generally versus looking just programmatically as to whether or not we served a number of people and connected a number of households?
Yeah,
Can I make a rude comment? Like, some of the baby supply thing had to be with, America preferences for America, only. So I just want to put that in.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't going to say that, Michelle, but I was thinking
It goes back to my point.
Right. That's right. Do we need a broad stroke evaluation process? Because if we're putting all this money into an investment, I think that we're all saying, for people listening, towards the economic growth of this country, it's worthwhile an interagency evaluation point two to see if it's impressed change on how we actually deliver services and reach outcomes generally for populations.
And yeah, just to reiterate, I think it is the boring reporting requirements that make that happen. And so actually requiring grantees to report numbers back. So BTOP, there was no reporting requirements after the fact. And so I tried to collect data, and after the money was spent and the final report was submitted, nothing, no results. And in other programs like E-Rate, scholars like ourselves, we're combining grades data with broadband data, and just to have that data. And really the only people who can require reporting is the government. You can try crowdsourcing, you can try collecting data, but that's very low hanging fruit. And it's just mind-boggling that we wouldn't insist on it if we're spending so much money to require really, it might sound like it's overhead for reporting requirements, but that's actually very low cost, I would think.
Yeah, well, so I mean, to be clear, we're going to do our best to include really strong reporting requirements. But Sarah, you did also touch on as with what we were discussing at the beginning of the panel, you have to balance the detail of the reporting with the costs that the reporting entails, right? So we could get all the way down to, really detailed data related to location of facilities or, collecting and cataloging demographic info, not just of subcontractors, but of the customers that the subcontractors engage with, or at each step, you could take a second step, right? You could demand 5 years, 10 years, 15 years report out. We have to balance that too. We're going to do the most robust reporting we can do that makes sense in the context of the program. And we're really happy to get input, especially from both practitioners, stakeholders, and academics, to figure out what the most useful fashion for that reporting to be, and the most useful fashion for us to gather that data and then make it available to folks so that they can hold us accountable.
Can I just say, with a lot, if you have locational data, there are a lot of data sets that we can then match to demographics and things. So realistically, you don't have to make it onerous, but you have to be specific about what you want to know, because people don't like math. They don't like numbers on average. That's what I find. And so they'll report, oh, we've had all this success, but they don't give us the data we need. And it's not actually a higher cost. It's just something they don't want to do because it's math. It's unpleasant. But if you, and I think this would be a great role for the NTIA to say, look, let us suggest to you metrics that to the states, because this is a lot on the states to figure out how to do all of this when they've never necessarily done anything, they've never necessarily done a lot of these things before. So if the NTIA could give them like, oh, look, this would be the perfect metrics to continue and ask specifically for that, because they'll always say, yeah, we'll just give you the information generally. And that's why we still don't have good mapping data, because no one ever is willing to force people to give the correct data. But if we ask for the correct data, we don't have to ask for a lot.
Mm-hmm. Right. And this could go back to, Michelle, to your point, partnerships with the digital equity plans overall with community colleges or academic institutions, local institutions that can help create the right data formats and the right questions for states. Because I do feel, at the end of the day, states are going to do as much as they can. They've got a timeline. They've got these requirements. They've got to figure out they can buy American, if they're going to hire people, finding ways that you can give benefits or incentivize states to work with local universities, I think would also be very helpful too.
Well, to be clear, I mean, we're not just going to take in reports that the states give us and that's going to be that. I mean,
of course.
We're going to establish what we expect them to report to us, and then they're going to do that. It's not just going to be, hey, tell us about it in whatever fashion you like.
No, I get that. But one of the things that we're finding out, particularly from the scholar community, the think tank community, it's not just about the numbers. It's about the storytelling. It's about the authentic experiences that actually come out of those. I mean, I know in my own travels around the country, talking to people, really hearing what the country is saying about, whether or not this has improved their condition, I think is really important. And so the extent to which you could actually find ways, it's kind of, like you said, this is an iterative process to have an evaluation component that sort of incentivizes these type of local partnerships with local universities. It builds that ecosystem so that, as with BTOP and TOP, where there was not a lot of data available, you're actually getting people to put those data sets into play that I think could be useful alongside the bureaucratic data points that you're going to collect.
Well, don't be shy. Tell us. I mean, that's
part
of the reason we're here, right? Like, this is all still in development. So, to the extent that
just sort of going back to something that Michelle said about the data, I think if NTIA could provide some sort of a rubric that all states could provide the data in a similar format, something like that would be super useful in terms of evaluation. We've seen it when we do like merger analysis, right? Once we provide that rubric, it's much easier even for the companies to fill it in rather than leave it to them to do stuff. And on sort of that, things like you're doing this on a project basis anyway, because there's a provision in a location. If 8 projects are served versus 2 are unserved, you get to do those 2 projects. So the data is already there. It's a question of how do you put it in a format that it's useful for evaluation and to sort of the researchers, the academic community, and the people who want to evaluate this.
Right. I will say we do have it. So completely agree. And, I think this is also part of Nicole talking about the relevance issues, right? And when we were planning this program at NTIA and with the Secretary of Commerce, knowing that it's just as Nicole said, it's not just about access. This has to be an ongoing conversation with Americans to really bring them into this ecosystem, for them to want to be online. Yes, they've lived through the pandemic, and that may have changed the situation for many who realized that this was the only way to get to a doctor's appointment, to shop, for your child to get to school, to do homework. And so that changed for many. We track that, Nicole mentioned Pew. NTIA tracks this data as well through our internet use survey. We just got numbers out of the field that told us the first reporting post-pandemic, how those relevance numbers have changed. And so we will continue to do that tracking. But just as you're saying, it's about the stories. The Secretary of Commerce recognizes it's about the stories. And within the administration, those working on the infrastructure implementation realize that too. And so NTIA, just as Evan said, is working on its evaluation plan. They mentioned in the NOFO that more guidance will be coming out in multiple areas. They'll be working with the states on their evaluation plans, but even at that more macro administration level, I think we'll see more in terms of how they're telling the story across the implementation of this historical funding, so we can actually see the impact in communities. And I couldn't agree more how important it is. And I do believe there's the recognition for that. But just as Evan was saying, the more data we can get, and I would encourage everyone to be working with those states as well, who will be building their mechanisms in addition to working with NTIA. They need to hear from civil society, from the university, from the academics, so that they have that ability to be building their programs now and not waiting until they post their plan, right, which will be sometime in 23, but actually working with them now as they're building it so that they can benefit from this information as they're thinking this through.
Great. And as we're wrapping up here, we have some questions from our audience members. There's one question about trade-offs between fiber and fixed wireless, and there is some points in the NOFO about latency and about networks. What is your view on trade-offs between networks and technologies in the NOFO, and are there ways that Congress left things open for the states?
So I just want to briefly sort of comment on that, and that is, this touches on two things. I think there's a comment also on the urban, urban digital divide, not just a rural one. And I think a mix for the urban part of it, it's not just fiber, right? Because fiber is available. It's that last mile connectivity. It's those multiple dwelling units. What do you do about it? So I think leaving that part more flexible, the NOFO definitely has sort of a tilt towards fiber, and part of it is understandable because that's what forms the basis of all the things that we are trying to do. But I think recognizing that there are other technologies, and in some parts being technology neutral might serve us better than picking a winner, I think is something that we really need to recognize, and especially for this urban digital divide. I think it's particularly important that things like fixed wireless are given sort of consideration within the parameters of course, what's the latency, what's the jitter, can we like meet those parameters? But I think as we saw in RDOF, although some of the recent challenge processes sort of speak to whether some things work or not, but being technology neutral really gets you towards filling in more of the gaps.
I would say that I think the NOFO is written in a very elegant way, allowing room. Certainly the administration was looking for a way to maximize fiber, because of the belief that getting fiber deep across the country is going to help us to get to that advanced communications future and economy that we're all interested in. Being able to build 5G on top of this connectivity across the country is a good thing. And yet it allows a room, again, with the goal being on 100%, and that stretch goal of getting to all of Americans, giving states the ability to look within the state and territory at the economic picture, understanding where their unserved and underserved locations are, trying to get a sense of what the cost is going to be to serve some of those hard to reach areas. NTIA came up with the extremely high cost threshold, built that into the NOFO so that states can have that to take a look at and look at alternatives in places, again, with the hope that, the focus being on quality, not wanting those who have been left behind to end up with internet access that doesn't provide them with that 100/20 that the rest of the country is appreciating and experiencing, but focusing on quality, but allowing room for the states with a fiber preference, but in those hard to reach high cost areas to see what they need to do to stretch those dollars as far as they can go. So I think it's an elegant way of doing this, and also allowing waivers for the states when they have to look at alternatives. So.
Right. So I think that this is an interesting scenario that we have. The assistant secretary and the secretary basically said that they're abiding by the language in the statute, which is giving us the 100/20. But we have to be realistic too. I mean, there are going to be areas that we're not going to be able to do this in 4 years. I mean, there are areas that we have not been able to do with previous funding in 40 years, 4 decades. So I don't think that we're being realistic that we'll get that speed to all of America that quickly. But if we're able to get them something, we should start there. And I think that we have seen models where we actually stage out access over periods of time. We're able to build out whole communities. But I do worry, like Paroma is talking about in terms of our urban areas and whether or not they're somewhat being pushed to the side or marginalized, even in the NOFO, when it comes to the type of access discrepancies and deficiencies that they also experience. So I do think being technology neutral and evaluating these state plans on best efforts to actually get to that will actually make a difference. As it's been stated, there's some room in there, but I do feel that fiber is the key. And I have said that fiber is very expensive. And in the absence of actually maps that tell us where all the fiber is, I think we're going to have a lot of overbuild of certain areas just because we have municipalities that don't know where the fiber is. So trying to do that and then overlay it to states means that we're going to spend all the money rather quickly. So I do think that the NTIA needs to also be realistic in thinking about how this money is spent or evaluating these plans to see if these are going to be realistic solutions. We've seen this before, folks. This is not new. And so really ensuring that we're doing what Evelyn talked about, giving people the most reasonable standard to be able to get access. And this is the last I would say. This is why I find it somewhat problematic that we're waiting for the community anchor institutions last. Because in many respects, as these networks are being built out, those churches, those town halls, those schools, those libraries, those local businesses are going to be the lifesaver until people fully realize technology in those unserved, underserved areas. So I think, go back to Paroma, I think we have to be technology neutral. We have to assess, very carefully the realism of the statute language and guidance. We may have to provide some leniency in areas where we know we cannot provide that, particularly a small provider. And then I think when it comes to fiber, we have to balance out in states that do not have sufficient maps, the extent to which that solution is going to fit the entire community. Like Michelle said, Georgia's doing a great job, Minnesota's doing a great job, but a whole lot of people are not when it comes to actually mapping where their assets are.
Great. And so on that note, we're stopping at a hard stop at 1. Scott, his internet really is not working today. So he tried to get back on, and so maybe that's
fixing that.
appropriate for
I'll be over this afternoon.
Broadband. But I wanted to say thank you so much for your time and for your efforts in doing the NOFO and this huge effort the months to come. And we'll definitely be involved in watching and writing on these things. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Great to see everyone.
Thank you.